and gentlemen, and welcome to the 8th Annual National Conference on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 2021. My name is Patrick Kamara, and my job today is to manage the discussion that we're going to have in this conference. Our theme in the conference is Reclaiming Public Service for Inclusive and Sustainable Socio-Economic Recovery from COVID-19. A warm welcome to all of you in this auditorium, and those who are watching on television across Uganda, and those who are following us on our social media platforms. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our panelists have taken their positions in the auditorium, but we're going to hear first from getting opening remarks from Ms. Grace Pelly, who's the Deputy Head of Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Uganda. Welcome with me with a round of applause, Grace Pelly, to give us opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. It is a great honour to have this opportunity to speak during the 8th Annual Conference on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights under the theme, Reclaiming Public Services for Inclusive and Sustainable Socio-Economic Recovery after COVID-19. Let me begin by expressing my deepest thanks to the Uganda Human Rights Commission, the Equal Opportunities Commission, the Makerere University School of Law, the Network for Public Interest Lawyers, the Public Interest Law Clinic, and the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, who have all played an instrumental role in vulnerable people, and in spite of the mitigation measures that have been taken by the government to combat the virus. Economic, social and cultural rights are those human rights which seek to guarantee people's access to housing, food, water, healthcare and education, social security, family life, participation in cultural life, and many more aspects of our everyday lives. Economic, social and cultural rights have become increasingly well defined in national, regional and global legal systems, in laws and regulations, in national constitutions, including in Uganda, and in international treaties. These human rights create legal obligations on all states to ensure that everybody can enjoy these rights and that there are remedies if these rights are violated. As with other human rights, recognizing economic and social rights, together with the principle of non-discrimination, focuses all of our attention on the people who are most excluded, the poorest and most vulnerable people in the country. Historically, there has been a tendency to pay greater attention to civil and political rights, which are in practice, as we all know, often indivisible from our economic and social rights. The COVID-19 pandemic over the past 2 years has given us an opportunity to redress the balance by focusing our energies further on realising our economic and social rights. This conference and theme is extremely timely given the unique situation of the pandemic that we find ourselves in. Over the past 18 months, the Secretary General of the United Nations has been advocating for the support of all nations to realise ESCR during the COVID pandemic. As the UN office in Uganda, our mandate is to work with our partners to promote all human rights, which includes strengthening the capacities of our national partners to discharge their functions in line with human rights obligations. As we have seen, the COVID-19 pandemic has deepened inequalities and has created even greater challenges in ensuring people's equal and adequate access to food, healthcare, water, sanitation, and education. The Sustainable Development Goals stipulate that no one should be left behind. This conference, held annually, seeks to address exactly these human rights whose realisation has been threatened by the pandemic. We therefore wish you great deliberations over the coming days to ensure that we can all do our best to ensure that people are supported to realise their economic and social rights. The UN Human Rights Office in Uganda is fully committed to promoting the protection of these rights, and we pledge our continued support to work in partnership with the Uganda Human Rights Commission, the Equal Opportunities Equal Opportunities Commission, civil society and other stakeholders to ensure the realisation of economic and social rights for the people of Uganda. It is my sincere hope that this conference will offer all of us an opportunity to reflect on public service delivery in the context of the pandemic to ensure that no one is left behind. I wish to thank you all once again for organising this very important conference, and I hope we shall all have fruitful deliberations. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Grace Pelly. Please, a bit a round of applause for Grace Pelly. Thank you so much. It is so true. We live in a pandemic-battered economy. We're socially battered, we're culturally battered, and the economy is battered. And many people have had to pay. You know, when you go into rural Uganda, especially during the lockdown, the stories you hear are stories of abuse, of domestic violence, of inequality. You know, so many things have happened. So when we have a conference like this, I suppose we'll be gathering ideas to see how we can move forward in a situation that we're living in of that is battered by the pandemic. Our next speaker is giving us a keynote address. And our keynote speaker is a legal scholar. He's a professor of law, Makerere University, and advocate, Courts of Judicature of Uganda. Please welcome with me with a round of applause, Professor John Jean Badia.
Thank you very much, moderator. Let me take this opportunity to thank the School of Law, Uganda Human Rights Commission, ISA, and others for having given me an opportunity to share with you a few thoughts which hopefully will help the discussions around human rights, public services, and prospects for inclusive socio-economic recovery after COVID-19. I will give my remarks in 4 areas. I'll give the context in which we have arrived at a situation where socio-economic rights are seen not actually as rights, but as commodities. Secondly, I look at the revelations that COVID-19 has made about our government. Thirdly, I look at the role of democratic institutions in dealing with the pandemic and in ensuring that maybe the pandemic becomes an occasion for reasserting the role of the common good and rediscovering the importance of socio-economic rights. Thereafter, I'll make some conclusions. Now, the context in which we are faced with the COVID-19 and its impact is that with the end of the Cold War, there developed what was called the Washington Consensus, and the most important aspect of which was further emphasizing structural adjustment programs, which were already in place from the UPC or Obote government. But with the end of the Cold War, Western governments and the Bretton Woods institutions decided that the African state needed to be reformed and retrenched so that you remove from government not only doing investment, development, or the so-called doing business, but you also removed the state from the provision of public and socio-economic services. This would eventually culminate into an uncritical and wild privatization process that they gave the economy to foreigners and also a few regime-connected persons as their local compradors. The privatization and retrenchment of the state of the 1990s was therefore the ideological beginning of the banking common and public interests, or what one should call in simple terms, the common good, in favor of private and generally anti-social interests. The socio-political situation confronting the people of Uganda has been a living contradiction between the provisions and apparent aspirations of Uganda's 1995 constitution and the actual socio-economic policies that are being implemented. For instance, whereas Article 30 of the Constitution provides that all persons have a right to education, and whereas the relevant Act on Education also make provision of education a joint responsibility of the state, the parent, or guardians and other stakeholders, it was further provided that basic education shall be provided and enjoyed as a right by all persons under that law on education. However, regarding other rights such as health, it is not clear whether Ugandan citizens and residents have that right. What is clear and not contestable is that the economic policies in place clearly negate both the right to health and to education. I know that there are other rights that you would like to consider under this conference, but for purposes of clarity, I'll focus only on health and education. Whereas the national objectives and directive principles of state policy recognize the importance of health, education, clean and safe water, etc., and whereas under the 2005 constitutional amendment, these national objectives are supposed to be taken into account in not only in making policy, but in making laws and making decisions in courts. The question is, to what extent has this been understood and enforced under that 2005 constitutional amendment? This conference should deliberate on this matter. That is the justiciability of these rights. However, as I have indicated, both services have been privatized since the mid-1990s. Government continues to have policies, institutions, programs, and annual budgets to cover them. But the fundamental question, which has not been clear and properly addressed, is whether citizens and residents should expect education and health as rights that must be provided by the state. So it is in this situation that COVID-19 enters the stage. When COVID-19 dawned on us in March 2020, it was thought that this was an ordinary disease that would quickly go away. This has not been the case. We are therefore confronted with a situation which a virus originally considered to be either a Chinese or white people's problem, has now come to determine whether people should enjoy their social and even political rights. In the case of Uganda, almost all rights have been affected by the pandemic. For instance, using the Colonial Public Health Ordinance of 1935, which is our current law, actually it has never been changed, government has curtailed both political and socio-economic rights. In the case of elections and political rights generally, the pandemic was used to ensure that there were no political rallies, mainly for the opposition, and that there could be no mobilization against the regime politically. Those who attempted to do so paid a very high price, with death, torture, imprisonment, or loss of economic opportunities. Many are still in prison up to now, either not charged or not prosecuted. In other words, COVID-19 became a political weapon used to deny freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and the right to politically organize against the incumbent regime. Much more specifically, what has COVID revealed about the current regime? There are many revelations, but let me deal with only a few The first one was that there is a limit to state or regime short-sightedness. One of the initial and unexpected consequences of COVID-19 was to quarantine everybody at home within the confines of the state of Uganda. This affected all political leaders, including the president, his family, ministers, parliamentarians, government, and opposition political leaders. All of them were affected. Initially, nobody could move out of the country for social or even medical reasons. All the countries in the world closed their borders. If our political leaders were serious enough, this would have been the opportunity to rethink national self-reliance, especially in the fields of health and health services. Because this became very clear that without the internal capacity to look after yourself, you could just die, whether you are a president, a minister, a bishop, or a peasant. It should also be further noted that all the political leaders in the West, including USA, Canada, UK, and the European Union, had to rely on their national health services for solutions, not only for their leaders, but for the citizens. You all remember very well one of the initial victims of COVID-19 was Boris Johnson of the UK. And later on, even Donald Trump, although about Donald Trump we are not sure. But even other leaders like Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, they have all been affected. But all of these people had to rely on their national health service. Public, not private, public. It therefore should have dawned on our leaders that the Western leaders who had been pushing for privatizing public enterprises down our throats had never really privatized their own public services. It would therefore be most unfortunate for our leaders not to learn the good and obvious lessons given by COVID-19 regarding public services and the common good. The second revelation was the behavior still of the Western countries as far as human rights are concerned. The initial reaction of the West, including the European Union as a whole, was to suspend the idea of human rights and even the idea of freedom of movement of people, workers, and capital, although these freedoms are guaranteed under their laws. All these countries closed their borders to every foreigner. Even internal freedom of movement and association within the state was also curtailed. It could be said that the curtailment of these freedoms was necessary, not only to contain the pandemic, but actually save lives of everyone. What becomes more controversial is how then countries continue to behave even after the discovery of vaccines, which can greatly slow down or even fully contain the spread of the pandemic. So rights are still under attack because of COVID-19 worldwide. Number three, COVID-19 became a socio-economic and political equalizer. One of the biggest benefits of COVID-19, from which the whole world had an opportunity to reorganize socio-economic relations, was that it became a socio-economic and political equalizer. It did not respect social class, it did not respect race, it did not respect danger. Initially, it was only respecting age. The earliest shock, as I have said, was the attack of this disease on leaders of the West. But these leaders relied on public health services in spite of their non-political ideologies, especially the conservative political leaders. In the case of the UK, for instance, the Conservative government now acknowledges the importance of the National Health Service, and it has initiated a new health and social care tax it has its own controversies, but it is the Conservative government that is insisting that the National Health Service is very important. In fact, one could say that the distinction between the United States and the UK on this issue is because of their different histories and the level of working class organization in the UK, which has helped maintain the National Health Service. Because this National Health Service was set up after World War II by the Labour government. So there is a history of struggle and defense of socio-economic rights in the UK that is different from the USA, where the basic question of socio-economic rights is still a primary debate. It's not agreed in the US whether health is actually a common good or a private commodity to purchase. The fourth revelation by this pandemic is that although COVID-19 attempted to be an equalizer, having outgrown the initial shock, government has gone back and resurrected socioeconomic inequality, patronage, and neo-patrimonialism. When the first lockdown ended, all reasonable people thought that lessons had been learned and that this would help create a better Uganda in terms of public services and our approach to socioeconomic rights. However, the attempt to alleviate the impact of COVID-19 on the population through the provision of socioeconomic relief and other kinds of relief have further revealed that state patronage and corruption have never ended. COVID-19 was just a shock, but now people have got used to it and gone back to the old habits. Indeed, one must say that the opportunity provided by COVID-19 seems to have been wasted by the state. In fact, one observes that the regime has mounted a fight back in restoring rights disequilibrium and socioeconomic inequality. How has this been done? Because of the socioeconomic policies of retrenching and privatizing the state since the 90s, both education and health care are now essentially in private hands. The most obvious consequence of this privatization has been that education in this time of the pandemic has remained for a few privileged private citizens in local, private, and international private schools, while all public education institutions remain closed. In the case of health services, there has been an attempt to have the pandemic managed by public health facilities. This has generally not succeeded. And indeed, the private health facilities have had the opportunity not only to overcharge desperate COVID patients, but to actually create artificial emergencies and costs for profiteering purposes. This would not have been possible or imaginable with a functional public health service. The end result of policy in a neoliberal ideological framework has been that the state has not used COVID as an opportunity to review its misguided privatization of social services, particularly education and health. It is also, in fact, an indictment on the part of the opposition political parties that they have not taken this opportunity to map out an alternative ideological framework for Uganda's socioeconomic ills. COVID-19 has therefore exposed all the inadequacies of privatization of health and education and of neoliberalism in general. It is therefore not surprising that instead of COVID being an opportunity for socioeconomic and policy reform, it has become yet another occasion for patronage and abuse of public resources in a neo-patrimonial regime. The abuse of public resources, even in a situation of a pandemic, now looks normal because it has not been politically and culturally denounced. This indeed continues to be one of the major challenges confronting us as a society. Maybe it is not yet too late for us to use COVID-19 as an opportunity for soul-searching and self-reflection as a society. I now come to the gist of this discussion. Democracy, state policy, and dealing with COVID-19 and the fate of socioeconomic rights. The current situation of COVID-19 forces us to reflect on the question of democracy, the role of democratic institutions, and state policy regarding socio-economic rights. One of the major debates in Uganda has been what legal framework should have been used or should be used even now to deal with the pandemic. And there were three options. One, a declaration of a state of emergency, the use of the Public Health Act or Ordinance of 1935, or a completely new legal regime. My view is that those who have been agitating for a state of emergency are misguided because they seem not to understand the political situation under which a state of emergency should be declared. A declaration of emergency in the Ugandan situation would have been most inappropriate and will even be inappropriate in the future because we don't know where COVID is taking us. The major reason I oppose a state of emergency is that our parliament, which is supposed to be a democratic institution, is not disposed politically to hold to account the president in exercising the powers of a state of emergency. It is a rubber stamp parliament and cannot hold the executive and the president in particular to account. Therefore, there would be no reason to give the executive and the president more powers, even where they can use powers that don't exist. The Public Health Act is itself not the problem. The problem is also not that it was a colonial legislation. The issue is that this law was intended to deal with any public health emergency brought about by any infectious disease. Under this law, it was the duty of every local and African authority to take all lawful and necessary measures to ensure that they dealt with the outbreak of any infectious, communicable, etc. disease and to promote public health. So the only issue is that the law has been abused. The statutory instruments that have been issued under this law by the Minister of Health can regulate a public health emergency if properly used. The issue, therefore, is not about what the Minister of Health has been doing. It is about the content, which is subject to debate, and the manner of enforcement. The manner of enforcement is a political question about the intentions, objectives, and competence of the regime. Indeed, if there had been a democratic debate about enforcing COVID-19 SOPs and regulations, the issue of which law should have been used would have been a redundant question. Accordingly, the option of enacting a new law for dealing with COVID-19 was always available but not very important. What was important was a political, socio-economic, and scientific agreement or consensus on how to deal with this pandemic. The socio-political consensus was necessary because COVID-19 is a threat to everybody, and it would have been possible to have an all-round political consensus on how to deal with it, irrespective of other political agreements of a long-term nature. The problem is that it was seen as an opportunity to advance and buttress NRM hegemony. It should further be observed that because COVID-19 was not handled in a democratic and inclusive manner, but was seen as a means where the social problems that emerged could be tackled or attempted using the usual dictatorial patron-client type of politics. That is why the president, without any powers under the Public Health Act or any other law, could issue an opinion or give a presidential address, giving proposals and recommendations. And the security forces would immediately seek to implement them as if they were law. In other words, people would wait for the president to speak, and the following day they would enforce what he had said, which was not law. This is because these government agencies either do not know the difference between an opinion or a law that can be enforced by state organs, or if they knew, they believed that they were protected by presidential infallibility. Because all they needed to do was that they were enforcing presidential directives in a speech. So it means that an opinion of the president can amount to law. It is even more surprising that Uganda's parliament has not dealt with these fundamental issues. The parliament should not be dealing with issues of COVID relief funds or simply appropriating funds to support what has been determined by the executive. These are secondary matters. Parliament should be dealing with the powers of the President and the Minister of Health in issuing laws and regulations. They should seek to be in charge of the policy process, scientific interventions, and the socio-economic consequences of the pandemic. Now, in this situation, what is the fate of socio-economic rights? In Uganda, the neoliberal economic and policy framework has privatized socio-economic rights. Education, health, access to shelter, and other socio-economic means of livelihood and development have been privatized. The role that the state plays with regard to, for instance, health and education is not ensuring the enjoyment by every citizen of access to these services, but it is rather seen as a political act of charity, or at best, government self-preservation. So when the government is trying to give health or education, the point they are making is not that they would like citizens to enjoy these as rights. It's a question of the largesse of the state, or the state having to attain some level of legitimacy, but not a question of enforcing or advancing rights. Thus, irrespective of the provisions of the law, for instance, with regard to the right to education, it has not been the concern and approach of citizens to enforce it as a right. There may be agitation by individuals, political parties, or even some civil society organizations on the question. But society generally has not regarded it as a matter of enforcing a socio-economic right. In the case of health, public health institutions exist, much as a whole public education system also exists from primary school, secondary school, in terms of UP and USE. In the health sector, there are health centers 1 up to 4, as well as regional referral hospitals up to the national referral hospital. The question, however, is, what is the relationship between the private education system and the public, rather the private education system, the private health system, and the public education and health systems? There are many issues as far as this question is concerned. But the most important one is whether the state regards education and health as rights. The simple answer is that having privatized the public services, and therefore having privatized social services such as health and education, these services have been commodified. They are commodities. They are commodities in the market to be purchased like any other commodity. Although technically there are rules on running schools or health facilities, these rules and regulations have been subordinated to the logic of the market. In other words, you have provisions in the Constitution, you have provisions in the law, and you also have rules intended to enforce the running of health and education. But the logic of the market becomes more important, is more powerful, is superior, both the Constitution and the laws. That is why there are now arguments about the cost of treating a Ugandan in an emergency. This has become an important question, simply because it affects the middle and upper classes and those who happen to be corrupt and therefore with resources. Otherwise, more than 90% of Uganda's population has been without reliable access to health services. They have been dying by the day. It is only COVID that has exposed the fact that without a reliable public health system, everyone becomes vulnerable. We all know the situation about oxygen and the astronomical sums of monies that were required to keep a person under oxygen, even just for a week. First, even those that could afford to have the oxygen ran out. Even after death, you are supposed to pay for these services that did not secure your life. In the case of education, the issues are even more blatant than health concerns. More than 15 million young people have been locked at home in varying degrees for more than 18 months now, with various social and human life-threatening consequences. The consequences of not having a reliable public education system catering for the interests of all citizens are not being seen today. They will not even be seen tomorrow or next year, but for several years. The consequences are several, but let me emphasize two for now. One is the failure of generations to complete their education on time. But secondly, the fact that, and of course there are consequences that arise from that. But secondly, the fact that there will be no primary or secondary education institutions to return to. We must understand this, that many of the primary schools and secondary schools will not resurrect at all. So where will the children go, even when we say go back to school? Because they were businesses which, on a business model, because of the intervention of COVID, have collapsed. The businesses have become bankrupt, and they cannot easily be resurrected. The simple conclusion, therefore, is that there are certain services that cannot be left to the private sector. The private sector can play a role, but must be secondary, not primary. Both health and education are such services. Indeed, this is why they are regarded as socio-economic rights and not as commodities to be bought on the market. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude. In debating and deliberating over these matters, it is therefore necessary to consider the following issues in order for the people of Uganda to have their socio-economic rights advanced, particularly in the areas of education and health, now and after COVID-19. As I said, I have focused only on these two because it would have been impossible to deal with the other services that you want to talk about later. The issue of socioeconomic rights cannot be seriously and fundamentally dealt with unless we address certain basic political and ideological questions, and they include the following. One, the basic and fundamental problem of Uganda's political economy is that our leaders embraced neoliberalism and privatization without question. If you look at our neighbors, Tanzania, Kenya, and others, they did not do this full and blind privatization. Our leaders saw these socio-political arrangements as politically useful in the 1990s. The policies dismantled state-directed socio-economic policies, including public enterprises, parastatals, commercial banks, and cooperatives organized by previous regimes. But these were not regime enterprises, but belonged to the people of Uganda. That is, of course, why there is an attempt now, however half-hearted, to revise cooperatives, public sector banks, etc. While these kinds of enterprises had political and managerial challenges, they were at least intended to resolve socio-economic problems of Ugandans. Neoliberalism and privatization must be rethought and reversed if we are to begin a debate on socio-economic rights of Ugandan citizens and residents. Secondly, in this regard, it is the cardinal duty of all serious political parties genuine civil society, religious and cultural institutions, to honestly and seriously confront the ideological deficit in Uganda today, not only to deal with COVID-19, but all the issues that this pandemic has brought to light and exposed in all areas of socio-economic social and economic existence of the people of Uganda. Thirdly, the most practical question facing Uganda today is, can Uganda's pseudo-democratic institutions, such as parliament and political parties, play any meaningful role in this situation? If Uganda's parliament and our weak local governments cannot have any say in dealing with the COVID-19, in terms of being strategic program leaders, policy leaders, then they will never have any say in any other major issue. They will practically have become socially and politically irrelevant. Finally, I would therefore pray that this conference highlights the fact that there are problems confronting health, education, and other public services, or socio-economic rights, which cannot be dealt with by mere allocation of resources or attempting to deal with logistical and delivery problems, but rather by first confronting the political and ideological framework of neoliberalism and privatization. Without dealing with the political and ideological framework of handling socio-economic rights, all other forms of intervention will not only be secondary and tokenistic, but they will be largely a waste of time and will engender no fundamental change in the socio-economic lives of the people of Uganda. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that I have given a few of my thoughts, which will be useful for all the participants in this conference to have deliberations on all the other major issues that will be confronting us both today and tomorrow. I thank you.
Thank you very much. A bigger round of applause for Professor of Law at Makerere University, Professor John Jinbaria. I listened to him so keenly. And by the way, do you know that today, September 15th, is International Democracy Day? The people who organized this conference, did you know that? You are right about talking about democracy on a day when the whole world is assessing democracy. There are things that I picked in the submission of Professor Jinbaria, that COVID was weaponized by people who wanted to gain something out of it. And probably we saw that. That the health sector was exposed. Whether you're rich or poor, or even middle-class Ugandan, we are all in perpetual vulnerability. If you went to hospital, God forbid you're having COVID, you either have to sell your land and everything, and perhaps even that money won't be enough. That's where we reached. If the health sector was a patient, I think it would be somebody suffering from multiple organ failure in ICU. But he says we have missed an opportunity to build self-reliance so that we can stand on our own, because COVID has exposed that. Rights were abused in the enforcement of SOPs. I heard that. But what do we need, in my view, from his presentation? We need a vibrant citizenry. People who will demand their rights, people who know their rights and their responsibilities, so that they can put those leaders whom they have given their mandate to lead on task. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a panel discussion. May I request Professor Varia and Grace Pelly to take up seats in the audience so that I can bring the panelists. Please, a round of applause as they sit back. Our panelists are men and women of substance, men and women who have a wealth of experience. So I'm going to be calling them one by one when they take their positions. Each one will have about 10 minutes or thereabout, and then we shall have the plenary discussion whereby you get to contribute to what they will have said, whether you agree with them or disagree. And like I said, yes, in most cases, in conferences like these, we can always disagree, but it's important to disagree with respect. So now, may I invite the Executive Director for Social and Economic Rights, ISER, Ms. Salima Namusobya. Let's give them a round of applause as they come. Thank you so much, Salim. May I now call another panelist, the Principal, School of Law, Makerere University, Professor Christopher Mbazira. We also have amongst us another panelist, Director Monitoring and Inspection, Uganda Human Rights Commission, Ruth Sekindi. And last but not least, we have the Economic Justice and Climate Action Officer, Akina Wamama Africa, Faith Lumonya. All right. I think I'm going to start from my immediate left. And since we're talking about rights, and Ruth, you are a human rights defender, and you are in charge of monitoring and inspection. I'm sure you did a lot of inspection and you did a lot of monitoring and how these rights, either they were being defended or abused. So take it from there, Ruth.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the discussants, Professor Barrier. He's always top-notch. I mean, you can't get anything better than that. And I liked his assessment and his overview of analyzing the situation and the challenges that we faced as a country. As you've said, as the Commission, we monitored the COVID situation, and we relate with some of the issues that he has highlighted. And we know that COVID-19 really deepened inequalities. And as you already know, thousands were pushed into poverty and hunger. At one point, someone said, I never thought that I would see a day when Ugandans are clamoring for beans and posho in a rich agricultural country. But COVID reduced people to beggars. So many people lost jobs and sources of livelihood. We noted that schools were closed, and we have seen how many children have been affected. And the poor got poorer. When we look at the statistics that have come from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, we noted that particular regions were affected, Karamoja and Busoga region, and they got poorer because of COVID-19. So there is need for purposeful interventions into these areas because it will take a number of years for them to recover. Now, when it comes to education, I think COVID-19 exposed the inequalities that have always existed in the education sector. Many elites who sometimes make laws, policies, and have the platform to speak, never speak about these issues. They are left with the Equal Opportunities Commission, Uganda Human Rights Commission to speak about some of these issues. And many times they go unattended. But right now, many children are out of school. But we also need to know that the children of the rich are in school. They are studying online. But how many Ugandans can afford online schooling? How many Ugandans can afford social media? Or even a phone or a tablet or a computer? How many Ugandans can afford the bundles, the internet bundles? Look at where you're coming from or your deepest village. How many children or how many communities or families can afford that? So the inequalities has been widened further. It increased sexual and gender-based violence. But the question was, do women and children have recourse? Do they know where to report? We were monitoring and went to police stations, and they were overwhelmed. They said, we tried to mediate, but what can we do? So the protective structures for women were gone because people were not working. NGOs were not working, and that became a challenge. It affected heavily persons with disabilities, persons with mental illnesses. They had nowhere to go. They had to travel long distances even to get social support. And it became really an issue or a challenge. And when we're talking about recovery, these are areas we need to look at. And like Professor Barrier has raised the issue of health it exposed the fragile health sector that we have. How many Ugandans can proudly stand and say, I can afford health care? We have been talking about the health insurance bill as a country. We need it like yesterday. Because after COVID-19, me and you realize that if I fall sick and I don't heal by miracle, I am gone. Because we saw what was happening in hospitals. How many Ugandans can afford 2 million shillings per day or per half a day? How much do you earn? So it exposed the issue of privatization, like we've said. Certain basic social services like education and health shouldn't have been privatized, and we can make it better. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a distorted and disorganized education system where for a child who is in primary, they move from Barara and are taken to Jinja or in Navumali. Is that right? Because they're looking for a quality of education. For someone to travel from Kampala to go and study in Arua or Gulu, and these children are 6 years, 7 years, or even 10 years. Is that right? I think we need to have a standard education system where every village, no matter where a child is, the education system is the same. That way, we save our children from traveling long distances. Now, the inequality has been further exposed because you realize that there's something fundamentally wrong from the core of our education system. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been looking at the wealthy countries. COVID-19 exposed how countries relate. Because there's no equitable access to vaccine, we as Africans were reduced to begging. We are lobbying with the COVAX facility. But then there was an opportunity because we got a wake-up call and started thinking about manufacturing our own vaccine. That was good. But then you realize that the wealthy nations, it is about my people, and it's not about the world over. So as a country, we need to up our act to make sure that we put in place mechanisms and social services, plus have the ability to take care of our people in the event of a pandemic or in the event that we cannot adequately address it. Ladies and gentlemen, I am saying that education should be structured towards how affordable is it for all Ugandans? How acceptable is it? What is the quality of this education that we have? It shouldn't matter where this person lives. It shouldn't matter how the economic status of their parents. But all children in Uganda should be able to access affordable education and quality education so that we don't have certain schools having different standards. Our children should be able to study the same despite wherever they live. And we're saying that COVID-19 has taught us that there's need to enhance social protection and access to essential services for the poor and most vulnerable, and also ensure that there should be an inclusion of recovery. When we were coming up with discussing COVID, we realized every time we're saying this sector has been left out. There's need for participation if we're going to talk about any form of recovery. Is it participatory? Who are we leaving behind? If we're talking about people speaking, the media was not looking out for persons with disabilities. How many media ministers were speaking to the public? How many of them had sign language interpreters? Others had masks on. But then there are people who do lip reading. So we leave a particular section of the population out. So it's important that there's participation and there's inclusion for all persons. And finally, while we're very happy with the COVID fund, and that it was timely, and I should say generous. We were, however, challenged that even in the midst of this, we still had elements of corruption. So when we are dealing with recovery, we should ensure that there is transparency and accountability to avoid issues of corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, another stingy issue has been the taxation. After COVID, the businesses have really suffered. Everyone with a small little business is being squeezed, and they're even paying arrears of when they were still under lockdown and they were not working. If we're talking about economic recovery, how are we helping our businesses thrive? We have to look at it holistically, as well as look at how we should ensure that we keep them working and not instead close them. So, and when we are talking about recovery, we have to look at issues of data. We were exposed by COVID-19, where when we're talking about the COVID relief, we didn't know the poor in our country. We didn't know who does what. We didn't know the unemployed people in our country. We didn't know how many border riders there were, or where we can find them. It is time as a country to have our statistics in order so that we know who does what and where these people are, in order to have a holistic and sustainable intervention if we're going to talk about recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, I am concluding by saying economic, social, and cultural rights go to the core of human dignity and people's livelihood. And if we're talking about recovery, it is important that we consider inclusion, participation, and a comprehensive analysis while using the human rights-based approach. I thank you.
Ruth Sekindi, Director Monitoring and Inspection, Uganda Human Rights Commission. You know, you've said so many things, but let me just also tell you what caught my ear: affordable and quality education. If you ask Professor Baria, I will tell you maybe back in the day, it didn't matter where your child is studying from, whether you are in the region of Kigezi or in Acholi, in Lango, in Bugisu, or in Toro, because that child would be able to compete with whoever. It was almost the same level, same education. You have heard of those great schools like Busoga College Mwiru in Busoga. You've heard of Narambai in Bugisu. You've heard of Boroboro in Acholi. You've heard of Muntari School in Ankole. You've heard of Nyakasura School in Fort Portal, in Toro region, or Nabumali or Mutole in Kisoro. But today, do you know why sometimes we find ourselves in a traffic jam in Kampala? Because we are all squeezing to go to this one school that we think is offering the best education. Everybody wants to go to Green Circle, to Kampala Parents, or City Parents, or whatever it is, or Lohana. Why? Because we think that is where there's some kind of a heartbeat of education. Why can't we have an equalizer of sorts so that we have education? Because we are all Ugandans who deserve better. Thank you so much, Ruth. And our next panelist, I think we're going to continue like that. Let me ask Salima to take us through. You are the Executive Director, Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. So many things are within your docket. So let's hear from you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to start off by thanking very much our keynote speaker, Professor Baria. He has managed to discuss this issue very well in a manner that is quite understandable, taking us from how in the first place we got to be in this position where there is commodification of services, to what needs to be done, how COVID-19 really revealed various aspects about our social service delivery and what needs to be done in order for us to reclaim public services. Now, as the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, we've been having this conversation from way back since about 2014, but many times people would dismiss this conversation around the need for public services as merely being ideological, and there is no real meaning for it in practice until when, as Professor Baria has discussed, we've had a situation of COVID-19 where now even the middle class or the political class that rules this country has found themselves affected, and then they see meaning at this point in the conversation that we are having now in terms of the role of public services. Now, just to emphasize a few things from what Professor Barry has said, from the perspective of a practitioner, since we've been focusing on social and economic rights as an organization. First of all, we've come to the conclusion that there are certain critical social services that are critical to human dignity, that are critical to the full development of the individual and the society, and that are critical to the well-being of individuals and societies. These social services, including services like health, like education, like social protection, housing, should not be left in the hands of the private sector. They should not be left at the whims of business people, but they should be services that are controlled, managed by the state, and at all times the state should retain the stewardship of these services because they play a critical function within the lives of individuals, but also for the economic development of the country as a whole, but also to ensure that each individual, each community, regardless of their social and economic background, are able to access these services. So for us, it is not a debate anymore that we need to reclaim social services, because gradually we've seen, and I will not belabor the history that Professor Barry gave us, we've seen that over time there has been an increase in the unregulated involvement of the private sector in the social service industry to a level that these services have become commodified, but the commodification has also crept into the public sector. As the public seeks to compete with the private, we see that also the services that ideally should be public have been commodified, and we see such things as the attempt, for example, to create private wings within the public hospitals. We also see this within the education sector. We see that schools that are receiving, that are grant aided by the government, that are receiving funds from the government, are also actually charging a lot of money in comparison, sometimes even more money than what is being charged by the private schools. So the commodification has gotten to a level that regardless of whether one is utilizing the public or the private, they are paying through the nose. Out-of-pocket expenditure is extremely high, and there must be urgent intervention to actually reverse the trend, because as was said again, this is a matter of human rights, social and economic rights. It is not a matter of charity. We are enforcing rights here. The other key issue that also has been a debate for a very long time is the question of whether the private involvement in social services is only an issue of regulation. For some people, the solution always has been that, okay, the private sector should be involved in these services, but with adequate regulation. And again, from experience, from research, we've seen that this is not an issue of mere regulation of the private sector, because even where that exists, there are still problems. But also within our Ugandan context, we see that there is a general lack of capacity of the state to regulate. Sometimes it is a reluctance of the state to regulate. And we've seen that this, again, has come up very prominently within the COVID-19 time, where we've seen that the state struggling to regulate private health service providers. And we've seen that yesterday I saw some letter going around on social media where the police was some boss in the police was asking police officers to keep intervening to investigate cases of where the private sector is taking advantage of patients, overcharging or detaining bodies and extorting the public. And we should not be in this position in the first place. In our case as Uganda, the liberalization that happened, letting the private sector in, was done prior to any meaningful form of regulation happening. So you find that the state has always been playing catch-up to regulate the private sector, and it has been grossly ineffective. It has been a complete failure, as we've seen. Even with the private sector in education, there was a point where there was a debate of regulation of school fees. And the private sector came out strongly through their associations to say, wait a minute, yes, if government wants to have this discussion, please have it with the public institutions, have it with the public education institutions, but you should not be having it with the private sector because we are private and you should not be interfering. And all this is happening in a situation where at the same time the private sector wants the government to give them support in terms of sometimes waiving taxes, in terms of sometimes actually giving them subsidies in various formats in order for them to thrive. But on the other hand, they want deregulation on their part, not being able to pay taxes, for example, even where they are making profit. So for us, as an organization, we've come to the conclusion that the profit motive of the private sector is inconsistent with the common good. And our call has always been that the state must retain control of certain basic social services and be able to play a stewardship role and be able to manage the provision of services, but leave room for that small group of people who will always be attracted to exclusivity, who will always be attracted to expensive things, such that going to use a private health facility or going to use a private school should be a question of choice, but not a question of being forced as we are now, because right now people are being forced to move to the private simply because we have a dysfunctional public health and education system. Because of the poor quality that we've been seeing, that has resulted from many issues. Part of it is the stagnating or declining funding in terms of budgetary allocations to these sectors, but part of it is also the lack of the political will, the lack of ideology that caters for the poor and the vulnerable, to be able to ensure that there is an equivalent quality public system that is operating alongside the private system. Because if we had indeed, as the professor said, if we had a functional public health or public education system, we would not be having the debate of having to regulate the private sector, because the people would be able to get the services that they require from the public system, and the private sector would have to actually also play along what is happening with the public systems. But as one person said, I think it's a journalist, Kalinachi, I think, who said that for the likes of Nakasero or other private entities to thrive, the public system had to die. And we are tempted to believe this because we see that there is very limited attempts to make the public system work, and yet it is clear that it plays a critical role in terms of reducing inequality, ensuring that everybody, regardless of their social or economic status, has access to the social services. services. So there's need for us to move beyond the conversation of just regulating the private sector and going back to the drawing board. What percentage of the private do we want to be operating in this sphere? What role should the private sector play? Otherwise, we find ourselves in a situation where the private has taken over. At secondary education level, it's been put at 66% private provision as opposed to what the government is doing. And the same we see for the health sector. But also we see that the profit motive does not allow the private sector to reach the most vulnerable, because when you go to hard-to-reach areas like islands or places like Deep in Karamoja or Bundibujo, you will not find the private sector there. So we cannot rely on the private sector to be able to deliver these services. The other thing that was touched on was the question of full recognition of social and economic rights within the law and the importance of justiciability of these rights. And I will not really overemphasize that, because as was said, yes, some social and economic rights like education are clearly articulated under our constitution, and there is enabling law, but there are those rights where we are still struggling as practitioners, as litigators, to go and convince the courts that actually these rights are justiciable. There has been movement in that direction in terms of the courts recognizing these rights, but we are not yet there, and there is still need for us to fully recognize these rights within the law and be able to give people meaningful redress in a timely manner should there be violations. Because again, as was seen, these are human rights. They are not just development goals. They are not just matters of debate, but they are human rights that do touch actual human beings. So just to finalize, Patrick, I just want to make the call for the public, for the political players, the decision makers, to be able to look at certain rights, and many of them are rights that are services that are aligned to the realization of social and economic rights, things like education, health, housing, social protection. These are things that social services that should be maintained as public goods, and all effort must be made from a legal, financing, political angle to ensure that there is functional public alternatives for these services, and ensure that everybody, regardless of their social or economic status, is able to access these services. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A round of applause to Salima. You know, you talked about the public system being robust, and I'm thinking, how is it going to be good if men and women in places of influence are actually not using these public systems? If their children are not going to those public schools, how is it going to be better? If they are ill and they're not going to a public hospital, how will they know what happens? So somebody told me of a story of a high name recognition official who unfortunately fell sick and went to Melago. But felt that maybe he won't get better attention, so he had to fly to South Africa. And they told him, okay, the person to work on you is the consultant who will be flying in. Maybe in a week's time you have to wait. And the very person he left in Melago was the consultant to work on him in South Africa. a Dr. Okello or a Dr. Semanda somewhere. So sometimes we need to build our own. There are many unpopular schools, Salma, which are government aided, but are more expensive than purely private. I won't mention them because that would look like economic sabotage, but they are there. We take our children there, you know it's a government school. Why is it asking more money than even a purely private school? So how do we make sure that the state can retain some of those basic social services that you've talked about? So we've been forced into this, it's very true, to look for private, because we're thinking maybe private is better. But Professor Mbazira, if all the students who have gone to private schools, are they any better? When they come to you, are they any better? Why am I hearing things of retooling? Why are you asking them for pre-entry exam? But they have come with triple A's. Professor Mbazira, you're next. And by the way, Professor Christopher Mbazira recently won the Uganda Law Society Award of a distinguished service in promotion of legal education. Yes, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and thank you so much, Professor Barrier, my senior in the Legal Academy, for that wonderful keynote address that actually brings out a number of issues. And thank you to the panelists that have spoken so far. They have touched on a number of issues that strengthen the arguments put forward by Professor Barrier. I'm going to base my presentation on some of the points that have been given by Professor Barrier. Patrick, why the pre-entry? Let me see you in Makerere soon to do the pre-entry. Then we'll understand why the pre-entry is necessary. Otherwise, my starting point, I agree with Professor Barrier as far as the impact of privatization is concerned. I want, though, to look at it more at a micro level. Because what happened, privatization happened at a macro level, but the impact trickled down to the micro level. What do I mean, for instance? I'll use the example of the social protection sector. We had the social protection sector that was informal in a sense. What do I mean by informal in a sense? It was not the contributory sector that we have now, but we had the public enterprises, you know, taking charge of several protection measures, providing people with housing, providing scholarships, and things like that. And that was happening at a micro level. You had the cooperative unions, for instance, in various parts of the country giving scholarships. There are so many prominent people in this country that actually started on the strength of scholarships given by cooperative societies. And when you look at this, actually, you can say on the strength of scholarships given by subsistence farmers, because these cooperative unions brought together subsistence farmers. So when privatization dismantled those public entities, when it dismantled the public-private enterprises that were doing things similar to that, that social protection sector at that level was dismantled with the trickle-down benefits that one saw. Now, the greatest mistake that we made as Ugandans, and the generation that was above 18 then maybe owes us an explanation, is that we resigned and chose self-help. What do I mean by self-help? We now distanced ourselves from the state as the provider of services, and we thought we could do it our way. That's what we thought. For instance, when the security system was being dismantled, we thought we can hire private guards. When education was rotting away, we thought we can take our kids to private schools, and we actually didn't stop at that. We even engaged private teachers in our homes to come to our homes and engage in coaching. The same thing happened to health. When the health public sector was collapsing, we did the same. And as a result of that, we saw some of the most vibrant businesses becoming private clinics, pharmacies, drug shops. There's a pharmacy at every corner of major towns in Uganda. So we thought we can do it our way. Self-help, if I go to Mulago, I won't even bother to go to Mulago because I know they don't have the medication, but there is a pharmacy close to me. When the public infrastructure, road infrastructure was collapsing, what did we do? Middle class, we invested in 4x4s. And I think this was a very big mistake in the sense that we should have fought back to reclaim our space. We should have fought back to emphasize the fact that the state is responsible for ensuring that certain services are provided. So as Professor Barrier said, that's where COVID then found us, where we thought that, we can address all the needs that we have through self-help. Then we discovered that actually with COVID, your self-help won't actually provide anything to you. Your self-help won't enable you to access oxygen. Your self-help won't enable you to access an ambulance and so many other services that we require, the education as well, and others. And the self-help that I'm talking about, it also came in a way that we saw some institutions emerging at a local level, at the community level, to try to take the space that was left by the state. Churches started providing services. Churches started being the safety net that people need. Social clubs emerged. In our times, circles have taken over. CSOs, the civil society organizations or NGOs, became vibrant because they were taking the space that was left by the state. But then when COVID came, the question then is, were those institutions capable? Did they have the capacity to actually respond the same way the state could respond? And the answer is no. First of all, some of them were constrained by the COVID restrictions. Churches were closed, where people that would have been in need of food would go to some churches and actually get food. Churches were closed. Other social or civic gatherings, it was not possible to convene. And CSOs that would have taken the space were actually also closed to a certain extent. And even when we are in a period of recovery, these CSOs that have previously taken the position of the state and should support a recovery have actually now become victims of harassment. We can see that the harassment is on the increase, the increasing closure of the civic space, closure of NGOs that we are seeing that more frequently than we saw pre-COVID, prosecution of civil society actors, we are seeing that more than it was before, and so many things in that direction. I read in the papers yesterday that certain authorities have been directed to closely monitor the activities of CSOs, and you know what that may be, how that may be interpreted. So these are structures that would help in the recovery process are actually, to a certain extent, being victimized. Then, of course, the young generation decided to use alternative spaces of engagement, which would also somehow support recovery. And of course, older generations also had no option but to follow the younger generation by, for instance, embracing social media and other spaces provided by technology. But again, what do we see? We see that those are being constrained as well. As we speak now, Facebook remains illegal in this country. As we speak now, there is a tax on data, and so many other disruptions that affect the use of technology. And what has this done? It has widened the space in the education sector, the inequality that we see in the education sector. Professor Barrier mentioned, and I think the other two panelists mentioned, that other kids are going to school while others are not going to school, because those that can access the data, which has become so expensive, are able to do online classes. Those that cannot, then it becomes a problem. I now want to touch on things that Professor Barrier discussed, some of the things he considered to be the body of his keynote. One was democracy. He touched on the question of democracy. One of the features of democracy is that it builds centers of accountability, is that it empowers the citizenry to actually demand for accountability. And it is the same empowerment that could have been used pre-privatization, during the process of privatization, but also during this time of COVID, to actually ensure that there is accountability. But what COVID has done is that it has re-emphasized, or it has strengthened the practice of having top-bottom decision-making processes. It has actually now concentrated powers in very few offices, very few officers. In the security as well, we now see the security agencies, including police. Police now wants to regulate healthcare services. How they are going to do that, I don't know. That they are going to use tear gas and storm hospitals and do what. I really don't know what the role of professional bodies that are supposed to do that. But why is that happening? Because the police has been put in a position where they are the alpha and omega They are the ones that decide what should happen. So that's why they now feel, as much as we may be celebrating that finally the police has picked an interest in this, but be sure it's going to pick interest in so many things, besides simply ensuring that a dead body is released from a private hospital, besides ensuring that actually a medical bill, instead of having 20 million, has 2 million. I don't know how they are going to do that, but be sure they will slowly encroach on other spaces, because COVID has reinforced the practice of top-bottom decision-making and strengthening this centralizing power around certain agencies. And in that, COVID has also, to a certain extent, erased Article 43 in our Constitution. We know that Article 43 is what defines the limitations and the procedures for limiting rights. COVID has now become the justification for limiting rights in a number of ways without following prescribed principles. That's why you see now the police also comes in. We are going to see other agencies coming in as well. If somebody's rights are being violated now, we are quick to be reminded, but these are COVID times, or we are enforcing COVID restrictions. The impact on the economy and the livelihood, I think that too needs to be looked into. We know that the employment context has been affected, business has been affected, people are not able to earn, and as a result of that, they are not able to maintain a livelihood that assures human dignity. And then what we also see is that one would have expected bailouts. Those are shrouded in secrecy. It's not so clear what bailout packages we have in place. Instead, as mentioned by one of the panelists, that's Ruth, instead we are seeing new categories of taxes, new taxes on services that were previously not taxed, increasing taxes in various ways. So that's only going to make matters worse. The irony, though, as far as privatization is concerned, not an irony, but maybe I should use the word paradox. When you read the National Development Plan 3 and you read the theory of change, one of the indications in the theory of change is that we cannot achieve socioeconomic transformation unless we have a very active state. That's one of the theories at the center of the National Development Plan, meaning that the state in the next 5 years now has to take the space that has previously been occupied by the private sector. That void was created by the state. The private sector moved in. The theory of change in the National Development Plan is that the state should now take back that space. But the paradox is that when you look at the budgeting processes and how much is invested in public services, when you look at the state of public institutions, you see that theory of change is not being pursued. In terms of regulation, again, if you are going to have an active state, yes, you can have the private sector and have the private sector regulated. I think Salima has eloquently submitted on the shortcomings as far as regulation is concerned. And one thing that comes out clearly is that in certain sectors, and this is prominent in the sector of education, is that most private schools are actually owned by persons that should be in charge of regulating the education sector. Just conduct research and find out who owns most of these private schools. You will be surprised that actually most of the people, the investors or entrepreneurs in these private schools, are just a few meters away from NTV. There is the Ministry of Education around the corner here. So how are they going to regulate that sector? How are they going, for instance, to regulate tuition that is paid? There has been an outcry for years that why don't we regulate tuition? I know that ISA has done research on that, but who is supposed to regulate tuition if the proprietors of those schools are the persons that are supposed to regulate? What's the solution then? I agree with Professor Barrier that we need to reawaken, if I could put it that way in my terms, civic awareness, civic consciousness. We need a citizenry that knows that self-help, and I got back to where I started, that the biggest mistake that we made was to think that as Ugandans we can access the things that the state previously provided through self-help. COVID has showed us that self-help has its limitations. So what we now need to do, we need to abandon self-help and indicate that for purposes of certain services, education and health inclusive, we are dependent on the state, and that the state has a responsibility to actually provide those services. But we cannot successfully re-energize the public or claim that space if we still have formalized constraints on the civic space, harassment of civil society organizations as we are seeing, and closure of the civic space in a number of respects. So these spaces need to be opened up, and we need to awaken as the civic responsibility on the part of citizens of Uganda. Thank you so much, Patrick. I'll leave it at that.
A round of applause to Professor Mbazira. We need to be bold. We need to be assertive. We need to be clear-headed and respectfully demand what is ours. I think in most cases we don't know our rights. We also don't know our responsibilities. The day we get civic competence in this country, maybe that will be the beginning of solving our problems. But so long as people do not know, or people are wobbly in demanding, then the people we give the mandate to lead perhaps will not be able to give us effective service delivery. So we need to fight back with respect in what is ours, for what is ours. You know, you talked about private institutions. I know in some schools, there's even a private arrangement in a private school. Have you seen a parent paying money to a teacher for special consideration in a private school? For heaven's sake, I've paid in a private school. I still need to see a parent and give something small so that my child is given a special consideration. This is where we are. And we are to blame, we, the people of Uganda. Right. You need to go to downtown and see people driving 4x4s we are talking about. Total disregard of the traffic regulations. People in public places, in offices with good cars, they have turned them into ambulances. You hear a car with a siren and you think there's an ambulance, yet it is a politician or whoever moving. It is one way and we're driving the other side, sometimes even when the traffic is looking. The degree of impunity, of total disregard, I'm sure people who come from the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe and other places, when they're here, you're perplexed. You talked about Facebook. You know, there is somebody who is working in a senior office in this country, and they could see that person sending announcements via Facebook for engagements of the boss. And I'm wondering, are you aware the boss ordered for the closure of this platform and you're using it for Facebook? I mean, are you going against your boss? You're also using VPN? It is not supposed to be working, and here you're announcing his engagement using the same platform? It was like, oh yeah, you see? That's where we are. But ladies and gentlemen, let us now listen to our next panelist, the Economic Justice and Climate Action Officer from Akina Wamama, Africa, Faith Lemonia. Faith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. It's not easy to speak after extremely intelligent people, but I will try. I want to begin by thanking Professor Badia for the points that he raised, which are very fundamental to the discussion around post-COVID-19 reforms. And to add my voice and say that I think now more than ever, it's important for us to begin to think about the kind of system that we would want to have in place, the kind of structures that we would like to have in place, structures that will actually take into account our interests as Ugandans. So I work with Akina Mama Africa, and one of the things as a Pan-African feminist organization, our work basically revolves around gender justice. And as a gender justice advocating organizations, one of the things that we have chosen to challenge the world is for us to look beyond just enhancing the participation of women, girls, and gender-expansive persons, to also starting to question the systems that have actually continued to perpetrate this inequality and the discrimination against these people. And so I liked very much the ways in which Professor Baria submitted his discussion, where he questioned the ideology. And I think that's one of the fundamental things that is important for us to also recognize. And so in addition to the issues that have been raised by this ABLE panel, one of the things that I would like for us to also reflect on is the role that has been played by international development institutions. And I say this because when you look at, for example, the structure adjustment programs, one of the fundamental failures of these particular programs was the fact that they forgot the social dimension of development. And in that regard, focused on promoting capitalism, which is really profit-driven, and promoting really liberalization and privatization, but also most importantly, the issue of deregulation. And I think one of the things I really appreciated was the points that were raised by Salima, when she was talking about the fact that regulation is important, but we can no longer focus on just that. And just to also explain that, I think one of the things that we need to do is to begin to confront the contribution that international institutions like IMF and World Bank continue to make in terms of our development strategies. If you will recall, one of the things that happened during this period was that IMF has been offering a number of loans, not only to Uganda, but also other countries, other African countries. And one of the conditions they put forward is for austerity measures, basically focusing on getting governments to reduce on the amount of revenue or resources that they're allocating to key sectors like public services, and that was one of the conditions. We also know that, and this is really not in line with COVID-19, but in 2000, I think it should have been 2017-18, attempts were made by the government of Uganda to put in place a local content legal framework, a binding framework. And one of the things that the World Bank did was to challenge this particular effort and present a number of arguments. And as a result, this particular legal framework, despite being extremely beneficial to the development of our country, but also to empowering the most marginalized people within our society, was never enacted. So the role of these institutions cannot be ignored. And so I think it's important that even as, while we recognize that there's the state duty to protect when it comes to human rights, that there's the corporate responsibility, that there's access to remedy, etc., etc. We know that we operate in a system that is controlled by certain powers, and it's important for us to be able to speak to those powers. And so, I think for me, one of the things I would like to see, and I believe that that is something that would be fundamental in reclaiming the public services, would be for us to rethink neoliberalism, to rethink the system within which we currently operate. COVID-19 has revealed that this system cannot work. It cannot work because, like Professor Mbazira put it, we are operating in a system where it is survival for the fittest. So those already facing different forms of marginalization, and these are really women and girls, are the ones who have actually been most affected. When you think about the sexual and gender-based violence that has increased during this particular period, it has been because of poverty, but also when you further analyze, it has been the young that have been mostly affected. And also, when you further analyze, it has been people or girls who are actually within the rural region. And so it's important for us to think about all these intersecting systems of oppression, and that is why in talking about the need to reclaim public services, for us, the way we look at it is that it's important because those that are most affected, those that have been most marginalized by COVID-19 are people who are already facing different forms of marginalization. And so it's and that would be one of the things that I would like to emphasize. But also when you think about it further, when you look at, and I know that there have been arguments that one of the challenges that government faces in terms of being able to provide public services is the very limited revenue. But I think this is something that we need to also speak to, we need to challenge. And also because first is because there are existing opportunities where we can be able to get this revenue. We know that with illicit financial flows, we continue to lose a lot of revenue. A study done in 2019 revealed that Uganda was losing up to 2.6 billion Uganda shillings in terms of revenue. And this is all because of illicit financial flows, because the government really focuses on enticing and pleasing corporations, the private sector, but also because some of the regulations that within which we operate in have been sold to us as legal frameworks that will actually be able to deliver the kind of development that we want, but have not. But also to add to the issue around tax, when you look at individuals that carry the biggest burden of tax, it's individuals who are not only who are poor because most of their income is spent on consumption, but also women because most of women's life is spent dealing with unpaid care work, and we know what entails care work. There's a lot of expenditure in terms of consumption, but when we are analyzing the tax burden and analyzing the kind of sectors that should be prioritized in terms of utilization of this tax revenue, it's never sectors that are critical to women. And I think that's one of the things that that needs to also begin to change, to recognize, to try and center the needs of those that are most marginalized, but also do further analysis in terms of understanding why it's important to center these particular individuals. And also, I think another thing that I thought that I could speak about is the reactive nature of our government. And one of the things that that was clear during those challenging times of COVID-19 was the fact that our government does not specifically plan for citizens, because even when you look at, for example, the cash transfer, it was really a reactive act. And but also when you look at some of the previous plans that had been put in place, they were not coordinated in terms of being able to address the challenges that were presented during that particular period. So, for example, one of the things that shocked me and was the fact that despite the existence of the SAGE fund, which really targets the elderly within the country, that the government of Uganda still had to create a separate fund to be able to support people during COVID-19, and could not stand on the capacity and sufficiency of the fund that they had already been providing.
Faith, I'm afraid your time is running out.
Okay, let me just make one point. Sorry about that. So I think the point I'm trying to make really is the need for us to, for our government to be less reactive but more proactive, but also to put in place programs that are not short-term in nature, because in addressing development challenges, there will obviously be a challenge that will come one after another. And so it's important that government takes that into account, but also, and most importantly, centers those that are most marginalized. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Faith, for your presentation. Okay, we seem to be like a few minutes behind, so I'm going to ask for a very brief panel discussion. Maybe you have a question or two you want to add to ask these people. You'll put up your hand. Please be precise and concise. And I'm going to take maybe about 3 or 4 reactions from you. And be specific. If you want somebody to answer you, maybe say the name. So yes, I have a gentleman who's had his hand up. Your name, sir, and where you're from, and please make it very brief.
Thank you so much.
Because we'll have another panel discussion to take over right away.
Thank you so much. My name is Amuriat Pascal. I work for an organization which is a member of Uganda Consortium on Corporate Accountability, TEQUIP. I just wanted to reinforce, but also ask a question after, to reinforce what Professor Baria was talking about, especially when it comes to revelations and context. It is indeed true that while we are talking about reclaiming, there are places which have never had social services in this country. One of them is Tisai Island, and we are still working with ISA and UCCA to ensure that they get support. No school, no hospital, no road network, no clean water, a community hosting about 7,000 people. So when we're talking about reclaiming, there are places which have never received social services. So it's just to reinforce. Secondly, if you look at a local example in Soroti Regional Referral Hospital, with the highest number of ICU patients as of yesterday, the oxygen plant is destroyed, but they are airlifting oxygen cylinders to Soroti. The cost of airlifting oxygen cylinders to Soroti every day, yet actually just refurbishing it is about 200 million. If we're able to refurbish it just at 200 million, we'll solve the problem of ICU and so on. Then it comes, the other sector that I want to talk about is transport. It has been ignored in this. But the cost of traveling to Kampala and other places has doubled. This has a huge impact on our economic lives. And so I urge that in this discussion, we don't ignore the transport sector. Actually, it is the one which is 100% privatized. In terms of the road transport, there is no government facility to help. So lastly, Professor talked about political and ideological way to decide some of these issues. I think among them we should rethink the issue of homeschooling, because it appears people are preferring homeschooling at the same time. there are parents who are enjoying the services. Is the question therefore, when we are rethinking, is homeschooling, a public homeschooling policy, is it tenable in enhancing socioeconomic recovery? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. This is what we're going to do. Some of the questions that have been asked, that he has asked, you actually took more time than expected. So you have taken the time of all other people who would have asked, but this is what we're going to do. You're watching the 8th Annual National Conference on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights 2021, reclaiming public services for inclusive and sustainable socio-economic recovery from COVID-19. We are coming to you live from the Serena Conference Center here at the Kampala Serena Hotel. We're going to take a break and the conference will continue shortly. Rights 2021 with a theme, reclaiming public services for inclusive and sustainable socio-economic recovery from COVID-19. I want now to invite the next panel to take up their positions right here. Our panelists are Ms. Alan Kembabazi, Program Manager, Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. Please let us welcome Alana Kembabazi. Thank you. We have Dr. Emmanuel Luyirika, Executive Director, African Palliative Care Association. Let us welcome Dr. Luyirika. Our next panelist is Honorable Abbas Luyombo, who is a fourth-year law student, School of Law, Makerere University, Prime Minister Students Guild, Makerere University, and former GSCRC Makerere Law Society. With a round of applause. And last but not least, we have Mr. Nsereko Arthur, who's an educationist with 22 years of teaching in high school, now turned advocate for social justice. Let us welcome Nsereko Arthur. Okay. I want now to begin from the extreme left, and that is going to be Mr. Nsereko Arthur. And we're looking to maintaining health and education as a public good lessons from COVID-19. Mr. Nsereko Arthur, you're going first.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and thank you, Professor Jean Barrier, for that keynote address. How do we maintain education as a common good and a public good? Allow me to revisit Professor Jean Barrier's keynote and make the following very quickly. Number one, we have commodified education. Then he says, however, with blessing in disguise, COVID-19 comes in as an equalizer and leveler. The question is whether those that were in the middle class have actually gotten to the same level as those that were lying down there. For me, I would want to opinionate that what COVID-19 has done, it has perpetuated and entrenched inequality, especially for the underserved and the underprivileged. True, COVID-19 has become a determinant for access to education. Our schools can only run if there is a semblance of low infections. COVID-19 has allowed the health system, from Professor Barrier's words, a fictitious emergency response, something that we have not allowed our education system. These were the responses that we had. We've tried, but failed in the education sector. One, we promised education materials to go around the country. Have we done an audit to find out which people actually accessed these education materials? And did they actually go around all learners in the country? We did promise radio sets to facilitate the virtual learning. I don't know whether anybody saw, but all I saw was one single radio set that was still in an assembling plant, and to date, We've not heard of any radio sets going around the country, but we know that the Ministry of Education is running instruction programs on different radios in the country. The question is there access for everybody? When we talk of the SDGs, we are talking of leaving no one behind, including that person who cannot afford a battery cell for a small radio. The other response that we did propose was a television set. That has not been seen. We are still waiting. And then we went virtual. Let's allow for remote learning and remote instructions. Parents are paying for these classes on a monthly basis. Primary schools are asking parents to pay 100,000 shillings on a monthly basis for these virtual classes. On top of that, the parents are paying for the materials that come with that virtual class. And then they're also paying for assessment after the virtual learning. In an environment where we are grappling, first of all, we grappled with OTT, we dropped OTT and then brought in the data tax of 12% for a country or for a citizenry that must struggle to find a meal the next day. And all this happens in an education system where it is an issue of lobby with cash. Students are lobbying for placements in schools. And I'm talking of both the government-aided and the private-aided. Students are lobbying with cash for placement. Even the teachers in the government schools are lobbying with cash for placement and posting. Say that I'm not posted in a country school, I'm posted in a school that is more accessible to me. Even head teachers are lobbying with cash for placement in particular schools. And the moment we lobby with cash, we must recoup whatever we did invest. This is total corruption, and this has definitely affected our education system. So, what do we need to do if there is going to be recovery? Number one, as Professor Barrier did opinionate, we need to rethink and revisit the question of privatization of education. If education is going to become a public good for the common good, we must as a country sit down and revisit the whole infrastructure, the whole ideology of privatization of education. Somebody says there are government-aided schools that are more expensive than the than the private schools. Government-aided, more expensive than a private school. And then we are calling on the regulators. Professor Chris Bazera put it clearly. The same would-be regulators of such practices are proprietors in the schools. So they are running a business on one hand and regulating processes on another. That education will remain a commodity and not a common good until this government wakes up and says we are going to clean shop. Go to the Ministry of Education, find whoever owns a private school and negotiate them out. I won't say force them out, but negotiate them out. We cannot have regulators at the same time, proprietors on the other hand. Two, for COVID-19, we need to address this erratic and seemingly uncoordinated scheduling of schools if we are going to turn education into a common good. I am a teacher, and I've been a teacher for 22 years. Now, it pains me to say that I don't think I'll return to that high school after all this passes. And what has occasioned this? The erraticness with which schools are switched on and off. Our colleagues in Kenya, I think, took an easier learning right from the beginning and said, let us close schools and put structures in place. A year later, the schools are reopened. And so what are we saying as Ugandans? Let us look at our neighbors. What are they doing with their schools? They are open, yes. Those schools are open, but they are not open without any planning in place to manage the COVID-19 situation. So the Ministry of Education, the government, needs to put its foot down and have a more planned, clearly thought out education system. And what does this call for? It calls for participation of the citizenry. Then we talk about bailouts of private schools. We should bail out the private schools, otherwise the students will not have schools to return to. True. Is the situation in the government-aided schools, in the UPE, USCE schools any different? Before we go to bail out the private schools. And lastly, Patrick, we need to craft a recovery plan, especially for the girl child that is going to be forced out of school because of pregnancy occasioned by the COVID situation. There are two categories of girls. There is that particular one who does not want even to return to school because of circumstances beyond their control. But there is also this other one who wants to return to school. And the question is, as a country, have we sat down to clearly rethink a program for these particular vulnerable students whose access to education has been put at risk courtesy of COVID-19? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arthur. A round of applause to Arthur. You can actually see somebody who has been a teacher and now has become an advocate for social justice. A lot of passion, teaching, and social justice, I mean, dynamism in him. You said you have been a teacher for 22 years, but Arthur, with all respect, you look 25.
That is a job hazard for teachers. We never age.
Okay, all right. Okay, let us hear from Dr. Emmanuel Uyirika, Executive Director, African Palliative Care Association. Dr. Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you, Prof. Baria, and the rest of the panelists who came before us. I want to thank you for inviting us to this event. When we talk about reclaiming the social services as part of the COVID recovery arrangement, we need to think about where we've been and where COVID found us. Now, when it comes to health, education feeds health, and health feeds on education, and those two cannot be separated. Therefore, as I make my submission, it's important for us to bear that in mind. And in health, we talk about 4 or 5 things that will actually define the entire continuum. We talk about promotive, and that depends on informed health workers, informed policymakers, and an informed recipient of the services. In other words, you need to have set the ground by education. Number 2, we talk about preventive. Again, you require an educated health service provider, policymaker, and then a citizenry that is also very well informed. The third step is curative. Now, when you failed to prevent it, you now need to treat it and cure it. And again, that also requires the same level of knowledge that, again, education feeds into. The fourth one is rehabilitative. Somebody got it, got treated, was not cured, or has residual damage, then you must rehabilitate. Again, the same issue. You need an educated, informed health provider, policymaker, and then a recipient of the service. Then the last one is palliative, and that's really my area of emphasis where I work. At that stage, you are quite vulnerable. You cannot talk for yourself in most cases, and you need things to be moved by others while you wait for the service. And that's where COVID got many of the Ugandans, because you got into isolation, you were cut off from the rest of everybody. It has mental issues for you and for your family and for the health workers who look after you. And again, that gets education to feed into it. So where did this COVID-19 find us? We've been talking a lot about our health system. Uganda is part of the Abuja Declaration, where we're supposed to invest every year 15% of our budget into health. If you look back 5 years, that has been declining, and now we are talking about 5.6%. And that's not good. When you look at the human resource for health, again, that links to education, But again, the investment there is so low. For some of the disciplines, like for heart disease, you have to travel from wherever you want to come to Kampala to get any kind of services for heart. And we know that COVID bites the heart. Whether you are a patient or you've recovered from it, you could actually stay with some of the effects of the COVID on your heart. But there's only one place where you can get it. It's in Kampala at the Uganda Heart Institute, and it's not free. You have to pay for it because there's no provision for a free service. So we need to think about where it has found us in terms of the human resource. And then you come to, when you look at the African Union scorecard of 2018, Uganda was number 6 from the bottom in terms of how much money the government dedicates to the bills, the health bills. How much does government contribute? 14%, and the families 46%, and then the rest by donors. And we've been there, so we are not making any progress, and that's where COVID-19 found us. Again, that's something that we have to think about. And then you talk about the consistent availability of services. For some of the services, we didn't have them at all in most of the hospitals. We talk about ICU. Some of us have been making noise since December last year when COVID was first reported in China, that we need to look at our ICUs because we had none. And it took months, it took almost a year for us to get any kind of ICU in the country. And that is not good for the population. I always hear excuses that we don't have enough money. And I was looking at the figures. I'm not an economist, but if I was to have a second life in school, I would do economics. In 1987, Uganda was collecting the equivalent of about $2 million, $1 to $2 million, and the population was, I think, about 12 million. 20 to 30 years later, we are collecting more than 1,000 times of what we were collecting then. We are borrowing more money, donors are giving us more money. The population has only gone up 3 times. That means there is actually more money than we think, but the question is, where is that money going? Where is that money going if it's not going into health? By then, university education was free, it's no longer free. Technical education was free, it's no longer free, and that's where COVID-19 has found us. So what do we need to do? My thought is, we need a Marshall Plan. We cannot guess, like my colleague has said, we cannot keep guessing and having knee-jerk reactions to the COVID-19 pandemic. We need a proper Marshall Plan for the country on how we get out of the situation where we tied ourselves. We need to revise, to reprioritize health and education, stop exporting our dollars to take people outside Uganda for treatment when we can develop the service in the country and manage the patients here. Those are possible areas where government can get the money. I was hearing yesterday, somebody was talking about buying cars for district chairmen, buying cars for district chairmen. When did it become a responsibility of citizens to buy cars for politicians? I lived in a country, I worked in a country for 10 years, which was not Uganda, and the only person who had the state car was the president and maybe a few cabinet ministers. Everybody else bought their car. Government helped them to buy cars, but they didn't spend money, their own government money on buying cars. And for us, we have a fleets of cars on the roads, which money could be pushed into the public services that we need. We need to set up a proper functional national health service. In fact, if you look at countries that have a functional national health service, they have responded better to COVID-19 compared to those which were purely privatized. We need a Cuban-style or UK-style national health service, where we are able to guarantee the health of all our citizens. Just before I get to the end of my presentation, one of the things that COVID-19 has highlighted is communication, being able to communicate to citizens and they understand what you are saying. Now, most of the health communication in this country is packaged in English. The majority of the Ugandans do not speak English. We have about 5, 6 or so major languages, and it's very possible for us to ensure that it's standard, that all our communication is packaged in the languages that people understand. We have RR, Runyankole Ruchiga, Runyoro Rutoro, we have Luganda, we have Luo, we have Akarimojong or Ateso, we have Rugbara. and have those as standard packages in the languages that people will understand. Because without proper communication, or assuming that communication has happened when it has not, we get so many problems. Before I conclude, two more issues. The first one is mental health. Now, Uganda has less than, I think, 30 psychiatrists, and they are all here in Kampala. And COVID-19 has raised the issue of mental health more than any other discipline in medicine. But we can't respond to it because we don't have a system to respond to it. We don't have the manpower to respond to that need. My colleague has talked about the girl child who is losing out in this pandemic. We know that in health and education, the workforce is made up of mainly women. If you go to hospitals, if you go to schools, these schools cannot function without the female teachers or the nurses, female doctors. Men tend to leave these services earlier than the women, and yet they do a great job. It is therefore important that we invest in a system that does not even wait until school opens, but we need a system that should go out and look out for these girls before school opens. Whether they are pregnant or not, they should come back into school. We are sure we are investing for the future. And if we fail to learn that from this COVID pandemic, then the country will not have learned anything. Thank you very much, Patrick.
A round of applause to Dr. Luyirika. Okay, in the interest of time, let us have Alana Kembabazi talk to us, and then we shall have reactions at the end. Alana.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Microphone off. I have Marlo. But yes, I've been thinking what is new for you all, the viewers, you all here, because we've lived through a horrible, horrible year. I'm not even halfway. And everyone has talked a lot about this. But I keep saying, are the people who are supposed to listen hearing us? So we've talked about education, and earlier this week I was giving a presentation on UPE, and I remember I was showing the difference between the government data, in this Stella example, and research we had done in areas where I remember at some point someone is showing us how they are dividing a classroom into two with a curtain, and there are two classes, and the other class also has to share that half class with firewood, because then when it rains it's a store, you know. And someone said, but UPE is just for the poor, and everyone knows it. And I thought to myself, if the First Lady, who is the Minister of Education right now, allows this to happen under her watch, then can we say that people don't know? Can we say that they actually care? If in Karamoja in Amudat, for example, there is no government hospital at the district level, the community has to go to a private, not-for-profit, what the government says, public-private partnerships, the ones they've been loading to us, they put in money. But when mothers go there and they walk very long distances to finally get there, they are detained. And the result of that has been that the community is saying, we'd rather take our chances at home. After all, I have to travel long distances. I sleep on the way there. Sometimes I'm attacked by whoever is passing by, or even give birth on the way there. Then I go there, you hold me, I give birth. Sometimes the baby is dead. You can't even let me go bury. I am detained. And this person in Amudat asked, is your blood red like mine? Are we part of the same country? Amudat is in Karamoja. Again, the First Lady was the minister for Karamoja. We look at Mitoma, where there is no district hospital, and during COVID-19, people were just steaming. There was no options. The government chief whip comes from Mitoma. Honorable Otafire comes from Mitoma. These are people that have proximity to power. So I think the failure for us to get up and actually work to ensure that there are public services, strong public services in this country, we are beginning to think maybe it's a political decision. And the question I then have for you all as Ugandans is, what are you going to do about it? Because when we got up in June and July, when hospitals began to demand for land titles, and ICE and other organizations demanded that the government must step up, ensure our public health facilities are equipped, ensure they are regulating the private, they say they can't regulate, it's a free market. And then to our surprise, we had them say they are going to give the private money. But they've been giving the private money for so long. They've been doing it with public-private partnerships for health. That's why they've been saying, instead of building a hospital here, I will give you some money, you will reach people. And they know it hasn't worked, because we've even taken them to court on detention of patients and all kinds of abuses that are happening there. So why then are they not acting? What is it? How many more conferences do we need to have? Surely, if people are dying at the rates that they did this June and July did not wake us up, if the fact that people just suddenly lost their incomes and we all realized we are a bill away from poverty did not wake us up, when do we wake up, Uganda? When do our leaders wake up? And today is Democracy Day. So the question I have is, for whom does the state exist? Because I feel very compelled to bring the questions I have had from the people we interact with every single time. In Amudat, they said, for us, we are like forgotten people. We even had a whole report on that because it was said so often. In Sigulu Islands, in Amaingo, they said, here, when you're poor, you die. So then, can the state be said to be a state of any sort? Because you see, when we talk about public services, they are an integral part of the social contract between people and state. Today is also the day where URA is celebrating 30 years. And today I was having a conversation with someone who was on their very first board, and was very optimistic at the time. This was the 90s. And Dr. Luyirika, what he said about the level of financing is astonishing, because they were getting very little revenue. But in the 90s, actually until about 2017, and if you look at the health expenditure for about 2017, and the 90s, they had about the same level. But they were getting very little money then. And when they were setting it up, they were optimistic that it will get back to making sure that we are really working for more equitable Uganda with public services. Well, here we are. I saw the other day the van goes, it reaches all these remote areas. The utter hypocrisy. You can reach remote areas to talk about taxes, but you cannot reach them to get them a health facility, to make sure they have healthcare workers, to make sure that the healthcare workers who are doing little with basics, people, if you have gone to some of those public health facilities, you'll see healthcare workers who will tell you they had to deliver mothers with torches. There are healthcare workers who are deciding, this is an emergency, I have no gloves, does the person die or not, and they're endangering their lives. They continue to be underpaid. You cannot even get them basics like PPE. And then we see slogans. You know, we are full of slogans in this country. Oh, on Twitter, MOH delivers. We have now securing your future. If we are all dead because you don't get the health sector right, there is no future to secure. If our kids are not learning like they systematically have not done, there is the learning. People have been talking a lot about, you know, schools and the quality, but there's also the learning outcomes. Let's look at our kids' learning outcomes. They are dismal, particularly in public education. So we've reconciled ourselves the fact that it's a problem for others. We have lost any sense of empathy or solidarity. We have said it's an issue for the poor. And our leaders will continue to fly out. And there's a time when ministers, a number of ministers were flown out of the country in succession for health facilities. So I say to myself, so you know for a fact that our facilities are like this, but you leave them to the rest of us. And they take out loans in our name. You know? We are there. When you read those agreements for loans, by the way, oh, yes, you see, we only have 55 ICU beds. That was last year at the beginning of the pandemic. Yes, you see, so they know the problem. They ask for the money. Then the money comes, and then they will tell you something. You know, we used it for securing reserves. We used it for, you know, they'll come up with something. And as Ugandans, and particularly the middle class, we have become apathetic. We have said, you know, it's what it is. But you people, if you don't wake up now, you're supposed, if you're really trying to fight for your country, for your kids' country, this is the time to wake up. I remember Julius Malema said something, and I want to speak to the young people particularly. He said, these people are doing all these things, but they will go and we will be left. And Winnie Byanyima recounts a time when they came from, they were struggling with paying off Uganda's debt and trying to negotiate, and they realized they were going to have to pay off debt that had been used to buy guns to kill them while the health facilities were in dismal condition. And now they needed to get the money that they would use Fix on Health to begin paying debt. So you people, we need to really wake up. And as ISA and a number of organizations and people, ordinary Ugandans, we got very concerned in July, and we convened an emergency meeting. And we came up with a manifesto, and I'm going to just, I know that moderator is standing up, which is a signal I should wrap up. We have a people's manifesto and a coalition on reclaiming public services. And I just want to say some of the demands we say very quickly, sir. We demand the following. The government must strengthen public social service delivery for all persons, regardless of social status. And it must be in line with the international human rights law, accessible, available, acceptable, and of the highest possible quality without discrimination, accountable, and participatory. The government should robustly invest in public social services, which are the first point of call for the poor and most vulnerable. It must remain in stewardship of the provision of quality public services. They must be financed through progressive taxation, curb the leakages like illicit financial flows and other forms of corruption. They must be free at point for end user. My colleagues have said that repeatedly. They must be delivered by government. The government must ensure meaningful participation of the populace. It must refrain from commercializing and privatizing essential public services, health, water, electricity, education, through public-private partnerships or commercial-private involvement in social service delivery. It must instead devote the maximum available resources to ensure quality public services. It cannot fund for-profit engagement in public social services. It can't leave these social services, these public services, to the whims of the market. So I hope you continue to join us from wherever you're viewing from. Again, like I've said, this is a fight for our country.
A round of applause for Alana. If we get so many Alanas in this country, I think the people who have the mandate to lead will do their job better. Thank you so much, Alana. Our next panelist is a fourth-year law student, School of Law, Makerere University, a Prime Minister, Students Guild, is Honorable Abbas Luyombo. Abbas Luyombo is differently abled, so I'm going to help put the microphone, and then he'll talk to us.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and for the opportunity granted. I am glad that I am a leading consumer to many of these services that are being discussed now. And I have tried, or we have tried collectively with a number of people to see how we can possibly consume better services. But I want to think as a law student as well, possibly the framers of the Constitution knew that if my right to education is not respected and I achieve that quality education, my next course of action was given to me very fast. And possibly that's why they created Article 30 concerning education. And then the next article was about the family, because that's what has been granted as the solution to many students, to many children currently, because they can't afford education. I will be wrong to expect a reclamation of what has never existed. And that is simply because I know, and we know all of us, that those who are meant to create the change we need enjoy it most when we sit and speak to them from these conference centers. And any day you choose to change the means of addressing them, then they are in position to address your problems, but then you are a problem to them consequently. I do not think that the higher costs of education started during COVID, or they became a problem during COVID. COVID came and found a crumbling economy, which only made sense to those in the middle class, but those in rural areas, it never made sense to them, and neither could they afford to pay for their children, to pay for their students at higher institutions of learning. But subsequently, those who could not pay then, we think at this point we can prepare for them and they are in position to pay. Yet prices keep skyrocketing every day. And we have seen this challenge when we spoke about it a few years back. Those who felt were oppressed became the hooligans of the day. We were called hooligans, we were called indisciplined students. And subsequently, and a bigger problem, I think, at the end of the day is sometimes even when the consumers, you feel you are oppressed, those who pay for these services, they have enjoyed either a lot of comfort or they have subsequently inherited the fear from their ancestors. I remember at some point when I was at some station when we were told, we were name called because of we saying we think our tuition is too high and common parents can't afford. We were told, but some of you are government students and you're only becoming stubborn. And others told us, if you think it's too high, are those who are paying complaining? And indeed they were at home calling their children and telling them, I sent you to study. Why do you cause disorganization? Then thereafter, they are like, the government, the prices are so high for education. But then they are not willing to take any measures of self-help. To me and to those who are viewing, we shall always be shocked whenever we expect promises to be fulfilled. The other time, one of the leading parents said, it is good you are being saved from COVID. You rather get pregnant, but when you are free from COVID. And we took in that so well indeed. We are safe from COVID and the rest can happen. So for me, the major point here is, one, education and health must not be privatized as to the extent we are at, but then we shall be daydreaming when we expect ourselves to write the best papers and present them to some of these policy makers, and we think they will move them. It appears they no longer get moved by papers, neither does speaking to them move them. They do not care, it is none of their problems. However, when we take measures of self-help, then I can assure you we are guaranteed of either being listened to, and that one day they will think of addressing our problems. But at this point, either they choose not to listen, and they don't wish to solve our problems. But when we pursue self-help, they will at least listen one day, and they will take steps towards addressing our problems. Currently, we were told that the tax on internet is targeted to help education and health. I don't know whether, but they didn't go ahead to show us how much they expect to get from that tax, and how do we know they are going to put it in education and health. But that's the promise they gave, which of course we do not care because it won't be fulfilled. But then, the question still remains, we who are suffering, we who are victims of these unfair policies, we who are oppressed, do we still think we shall write papers and they will respond onto these papers? Do we still think we are going to sit in a conference and they will respond to our demands in the conference, when at this point we have the best citizen who fears most to hear what he or she is saying, and the best one is that who keeps quiet and laments in his or her bedroom? Those who are viewing and those we speak to, it's high time we rethink what we want as a people, what we want as a citizen, because anyway, education has never been the priority of those who matter in this country. Health has never been their priority because can't they afford it anywhere else? They have the powers to afford it. If we demand them to help, if we demand from them to help us to afford the same services, if they don't give them to us, what shall we do other than writing to them papers and sit in the conferences? And well, they are happy by that because that is all we can do to ourselves. Now, it is important that we sensitize you who are watching us that the right to education is not given to you by the state and those who are in the ministries. The right to health is not given to you by them, but you pay them to sustain them and you give them money to access the best services they need and to help their children who are privileged to go in those best schools around the world and around the country where they may not be affected by COVID, where they can study on Zoom and they can afford internet. And you who has given them all these services, you cannot afford Zoom, neither does your parent have capacity to go online. And when you realize all that, then do not expect that when you merely speak to them, they are going to solve your problems. Think of self-help. I don't know what means you will use, but see to yourself that then you build the capacity within yourself to coerce them if they can't listen to you, to create better services you need, because those who have helped us in the middle class who sit in these conferences, who speak and write these papers, actually some of their children can go to some of the top schools here. And after that, they will get government scholarships. But you who pay those taxes in those villages, your children go to schools that none of them can ever get a government scholarship, even when they choose to create them. And when you call them, they will tell you government has all these scholarships, government has disability scheme. Your children will never benefit from them because their schools are never destined to get these scholarships. So subsequently, I think and I believe that one, you who finance all these activities, you who pay taxes for these people to get all these services, you need to think of self-help. But even we, the consumers, because those who pay for these services that we consume are not willing to realize that actually what we are consuming is not what we are entitled to in view of what you, the people who finance these services, pay for. We, the consumers, must speak up, must stand up to be counted and realize what we need and demand for that we deserve. Because the online infrastructure currently, you have heard they are telling us we should study online. When you ask the infrastructure we should use to study online, it's non-existent. When they show you that which they have constructed, few can afford it, and even those who can afford it can't achieve the best out of it. As I conclude, because our time is out, possibly because I was giving the best solution, self-help is the best for us.
No,
we shall never reclaim services that are non-existent, but let's self-help ourselves and create that which we need, because we can't reclaim that which is non-existent.
He's an interesting guy. Round of applause to Abbas. We need a disclaimer on that, Abbas. I want you to continue on and on, but it's a question of time. Honestly, a question of time. And, you know, I think we need men and women who think and behave like Abbas in this country. You have spoken, and I'm sure your point has been taken. How sometimes I wonder, I wish we had in this auditorium men and women who it is their job to take decisions. Because we can sit here and come out about the best solutions, or even try to organize and cry and make sense. But, you know, probably we're making sense to ourselves. And yet we need to make sense to those very people who it is their job to make decisions. And sometimes I wonder, I mean, when you are in a conference like this, people seem united and agree. But what happens out there? I mean, is there them and us? Are we like divided in some group? We are all Ugandans, as if there is them and us. I don't understand it. I'm so much grateful to the panelists today. I thank you for your time, but most of all, I appreciate your insights. And so we're coming to the end. We just have only a few minutes. There was a question that came from a gentleman, but then the professor is not here to respond to it. How I wish if you could just add to the debate, because if you ask the question now, time is going to catch us. But it's your choice. So who has an issue, put up your hand very quickly. We're going to do this in 5 minutes. And yes, we have somebody with the hand up.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'm Kodi Kayinga Muduisto, coordinating COTFON, which is a network of grassroots organizations from Greater Masaka. Looking at, thank you so much, presenters. I'm a community activist from there. From 17 years, I decided to just go that way. But the reprisal, the intimidation that comes to our way, we must be prepared to defend ourselves. I'm working with the people on oil pipeline. Imagine privatizing, bringing the government valuer, you have a chief government valuer, bringing a private company to evaluate property of the people. Over 3 years, no compensation. COVID has come. People need to go to health centers, need to get education. Nothing is there. And when you come up to help them up with their voices, you are targeted. Your life is threatened. unless we stand firm. That is my community. I rather die for my community. I beg you to submit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All of us, we come from areas where we have elected leaders who represent us in the highest places of leadership. I think we just have to task our leaders to do what the Constitution of Uganda tells them to do. Yes, sir.
My name is Najib Kasole. I'm a member of the network of the public interest lawyers. I just want to add on the issue of the education inequality. And this has been going on for over quite some time. When we look at the UNEB results have been released over time, we know the worst performing districts are always from particular regions of the country. We know these poverty levels are always from one particular regions of the country. So in this debate of reclaiming health services, we call upon the government to consider affirmative action for these marginalized groups of people. The country is not balanced in terms of social services. There are people who are really down and they need really extra help from the government or self-help, like Abbas put it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, the good thing is that we are broadcasting this conference live to all Ugandans and people beyond on our social media platforms, so they are picking ideas here and there, and they have their leaders. I'm sure they will put them to task. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Mine is a note, really. My name is Joseph Byomhanji from the Uganda Consortium on Corporate Accountability. And Professor Mbazira is here with us. I want to hear his views on whether, if we succeed in reclaiming public services, it will address the rampant corruption Uganda is faced with. In my conversation last night with a friend, they were telling me the reason as to why government officials are actually stealing money is to be able to guarantee quality health and education for the people they care most about. It could be their daughters or sons, their kith and kin, their parents. So they are taking away our public resources so as to be able to afford quality health and education for their own. So I want to find out if the professor agrees with that line of thinking. Thank you.
Okay. All right, maybe the professor should respond to that, because it appears very few people are asking questions tonight.
Thank you, Joseph. Very quickly, I'm not so sure what the question was. Agreeing with the line of thinking that I should take away to take care of the people I care most about? If it will solve corruption, if I take away and take care of you. Reclaiming, yeah, sure. I think what is emerging from the conversation we've had in the first panel, in this panel as well, is that we must reclaim our civic space, is that we must build civic competence. And once we do that, then we are in position to demand for accountability. And when we demand for accountability, then we put barriers in the line of corruption. A very good example where this has happened, maybe another panel would speak about this, is in the health sector in some respects, especially through, are they called user committees, where you have user committees at the health care centers, 1 and 2, whatever. And you know, when they see national medical stores truck showing up, then they follow up. They want to be present to see how much Panadol and other medications have been delivered. We need something like that, of course, at a magnified level, and also to happen in a way that is supported and that is also connected and networked. Otherwise, I don't believe that you can improve the lives of all Ugandans by taking away money to take care of the few that you care about. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, responses, questions, comments? You want to add on what you've heard tonight? You put up your hand and tell us your name and where you're from. Yes, we have 2. I think those will bring us to the end.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Benson Tusasirwe. I'm a lawyer. Mine is really simple. From Dr. Baria and all the rest, they said the deficit in socioeconomic rates is actually a political question. There is nothing to recover from because we had nothing in the first place before COVID came. It's just a scapegoat. The solutions are political because it started as a political failure. But they never tell us exactly what to do oh, mobilize the masses must wake up. So how do we wake them up? We beat them up or what? So what is the political solution to where we are?
We are the people who give the mandate. So we decide to give whom we think is the best person around. There's a view coming.
Thank you so much. My name is Mildred Ochokoro. I work for an NGO called Rise West Nile, and I come from Arua City. I just wanted to add on to what has been said here, especially by Doctor, on the issue of the girl child losing in this COVID era. But I want to say that in West Nile region, the boy child is also losing so much because there has been increase in cases of drug abuse. For those of you who have ever visited Arua City, you'll find that a good number of our boys, some of them have been in school, but since last year they're at home. So they have taken up to drug abuse. And when you see even the streets, I want to accept that the cases of mental illness have increased. So you see many people, and even from the villages, people tend to bring the weak and the mental derailed to the city to be placed in some positions so that they're able to beg from passers-by in the city. So it is really an issue. And for those of us who work for humanitarian response projects, we have a very serious challenge in West Nile that is happening between the host communities and the refugees. In this COVID era, we have witnessed a lot of conflicts over natural resources because people have got to survive. You find their classes over firewood, their classes over even mere grass, because in the refugee settlement, they use grass for thatching. So I think these are issues we need to also amplify our voices on so that we are able to address them. And now the other issue we have realized with the drug abuse is a matter of legislation. Mairunzi is so much abused by the people in West Nile. And the local leaders have bylaws to counter it. But the challenge we also realize as civil society we have been pushing is that Mairunzi is not on the list of drugs as per our laws of this country. So it is very hard for the leaders to go ahead to do other enforcements which may not be supported by the law. So I think it is an issue because the youth are really going bad, including those who are in school. Okay. Otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Ochokoro. We have, I think, the last person there to give a view or maybe a question. Please tell us your name and where you're from, and make it very brief if you can.
Thank you so much, the moderator. My name is Diana Humuza from the School of Law, Makerere University. And it's just kind of a follow-up with Dr. Tusasiri's concern to Abbas specifically. I would want us to know from Abbas, what are the tangible outputs under self-help? We break down self-help and understand exactly, because the desperacy, I think, could be felt even as we discuss, and this has been ongoing. This is the 8th edition of the conference. One of these days, as I was sharing the notices, someone sent me a very long email that you've had these conferences, but is there anything that has changed? Can you point to this and this that has changed? So I felt Abbas's approach was leading us towards solutions, but then I was not able to point out to what exactly do we need to tie our notes on to realize that what he called self-help. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to give an opportunity to Abbas to speak last and very briefly about that issue, but I think we can't stop talking about these things. We have to learn from the Christians. 2,000 years since Jesus left, they have never stopped. So we shall continue. The message is always the same. Abbas.
Thank you so much. Self-help is a larger perspective. I will only be brief about it, and I think soon I should write also a paper about that. But I think one, self-help is we need to get down to the local people who are not part of these conferences, but who interact with these leaders. And we make them, one, understand and appreciate what they can do as individuals. Because we people who are here will teach ourselves on the right to demonstrate, because that's one element of self-help. And I will tell you, there is someone who fears that right so much. And that person will deliver when he knows that right, you're going to use it. If you start with that, and I will give more details, we are going to get results by the 9th conference.
All right, a round of applause to the panelists. And I've had maybe we need to go the Abasi way. The Abasi way seems to be maybe the way, and perhaps the only way. Thank you so much, Abbas. And this brings us to the end of today's 8th Annual National Conference on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights 2021. I thank you, all of you, for your time, but most importantly, I thank you for your insights, for having added value to our discussion. I thank you, all of you who have been watching this program on NTV Uganda and following us on different platforms on our social media across the globe. We'll be here again tomorrow for the same time to continue with this discussion. I believe Ugandans, we are good people and we have a good country. We have had the past that has been so hard, and I think we can always pull through, because Uganda, we pull through. This brings us to the end of our broadcast.